ール BU。I'm doing yoga. I think. サッツグッド。I am doing pretty good. I am playing Minecraft while listening to Twitch streams so I'll be listening to your stream while I play. オーライト。
Dr. Richard Heyer studies the neural basis of human intelligence and cognition. He works with neuroimaging technologies to study individual differences in mental ability. He received his PhD in psychology from the Johns Hopkins University in 1975 and has since held appointments in the intramural research program at the National Institute of Mental Health and the medical school at Brown University and the University of California at Irvine. He has served on the editorial board of 3 journals, Neuroimage, Intelligence, and Psychiatry Research. He also served as guest editor for a special issue on brain imaging research for the journal Intelligence. He provides neuroscience consultation to university research groups, corporations, foundations, and educational and legal professionals. He's a popular lecturer and has appeared in numerous media outlets. In 2012, his research was featured on Nova Science Now, and he received the Distinguished Contributor Award from the International Society for Intelligence Research. In 2013, the teaching company invited Richard to create an 18-lecture course called The Intelligent Brain. So welcome to Dr. Richard Heyer today, and we're going to talk about the most controversial of all topics, I would say, in social science, strangely enough, intelligence. So maybe we could start with a little bit of historical information. I would like to know how you got interested in IQ research or in intelligence research, let's say. And so let's start with that, and then we can start diving into the nitty-gritty.
Well, really, it started in graduate school at Hopkins when I really became most interested in personality research. And I started out studying individual differences in personality, but just by happenstance, the year I started graduate school in 1971 was the year one of the professors there, Julian Stanley, was starting a study of mathematically precocious youth. And I was one of the proctors at the very first talent search for mathematically precocious kids. And I wrote my first couple of papers as book chapters in books that Stanley was editing about this project. And I saw these kids, aged 10, 11, 12, who were scoring higher on SAT math than Hopkins freshmen. And the question was, how does this happen? Where does this come from? So that was kind of my earliest interest. And in graduate school, although I really completed my dissertation on personality, I took my first job at the National Institute of Mental Health in the intramural research program in the Laboratory of Psychology and Psychopathology, which at the time, the lab director was David Rosenthal, who had just finished the Denmark adoption studies of schizophrenia.
Right.
And here is where I learned about genetics. My office was next door to a fellow named Monty Buxbaum, who was doing evoked potential research.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in that. And so my early interest in individual differences slowly morphed into an interest in individual differences in intelligence. And at NIMH, they were just going through a transition from kind of a psychoanalytic orientation to a neuroscience orientation. And I was kind of caught up in that. And so that's the origin of my interest in the brain and in technologies to make brain measurements and relate that to individual differences.
Okay, right. Okay, now you just wrote a book too on the neuroscience of intelligence, Cambridge University Press. And so when did that come out?
That came out really just about 6 months ago. So it came out, I think, in December of 2016, but they tell me for publishing reasons, they call it a 2017 publication.
I see. Well, part of the reason I was so excited to talk to you is that I've done a very large amount of research, especially not so much practical lab research, but investigation into the structure of intelligence and into its measurement. We designed back in '93 with a student of mine, Daniel Higgins, we designed, I think, what was probably the first online battery purporting to measure the cognitive abilities associated with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right? So hypothetically, the highest order cognitive functions in the brain. And we found, much to our chagrin, I would say, and this was a very painful discovery, that a lot of what we had been thinking about as potentially separable neuropsychological functions were pretty easily collapsible into good old general intelligence, that killer central factor that seems to unite cognitive abilities. And so it was quite a shock, especially because the neuropsychologists of the time, and they still do this, aren't as assiduous investigators of the psychometric intelligence literature as they should be, and tend to underestimate the central power of that initial factor. So anyways, I'm really interested into intelligence research, partly from a practical perspective too, because the industrial organizational psychology literature is crystal clear. For complex jobs, the best predictor of long-term success is intelligence, and it's a predictor that's probably, say, imagine you give it an R of 0.4 to 0.5, which is pretty decent. So let's say 25% of the variance. The next best predictor is conscientiousness, and it's pushing its limit at mopping up 10% of the variability in long-term performance. So IQ, it's a killer, man. And I make sure my students assess intelligence with everything they do, and it always ends up being a major predictor of things that you wouldn't even expect, like disgust sensitivity, for example. So your disgust sensitivity is higher if you have a lower IQ.
Yeah. The G factor is powerful. You just said
sensitivity, for example. So your disgust sensitivity is higher if you have a lower IQ.
Yeah. The G factor is powerful. You just said something, though, that I want to just make a distinction about. You were talking about the G factor, and then you kind of called it IQ.
Mm-hmm.
This is very common in everyday language to talk about intelligence, IQ, and what we call the G factor as one thing, and it really isn't. So an IQ score is a good estimate of the G factor.
Right.
It also includes other aspects of intelligence. And intelligence in itself, although it's a broad term, is only part of the universe of mental abilities. So if you're very good at, say, calculating on what day January 5th was in the year 1520, that's a mental ability that some people have. Doesn't mean you're smart.
Right, yes. Well, you see that with autistic savants often, that they're, not often, but sufficiently often, they have these amazing calculation abilities, for example, that don't seem to be manifest in a spectacularly high overall intelligence. Well, so what do you want to tell us about? You want to start with the book and walk us through it?
Well, that's interesting because the book is kind of a culmination of things I've learned mostly from my neuroimaging work on intelligence. And it kind of came as a surprise. It's the first book I've ever written. I'm now retired, actually, from academia. Never wrote a book while I was in academia. I was writing, journal papers. But Cambridge University Press called, and they have this series of fundamentals of neuroscience. And they wanted to include intelligence. And I regarded that as a major step because intelligence research really has been relegated almost to the peripheral of mainstream psychology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
and
it's politically suspect, to say the least.
Yeah, and the switch happened overnight from being in the mainstream to being really peripheral in about 1969. Before 1969, almost everyone who was interested in education was concerned about the achievement gaps.
Right.
And they felt universally that once you equalized educational opportunities, those achievement gaps would disappear pretty fast.
Yeah, that was the Head Start push.
Well, yeah, even before Head Start. Head Start, it came to Head Start, but even before Head Start, there were all these demonstration projects. There was the Miracle in Milwaukee, and there were all these things that showed that if you really intervened in early childhood education, which at that time was called compensatory education. The early childhood education term came much later. But this idea of compensatory education really took off. And then in 1969, the Harvard Educational Review asked one of the foremost educational psychologists, Arthur Jensen, to write a review of the progress. And this article in 1969 has become infamous. The opening sentence was essentially, we've tried compensatory education and it has failed.
Yeah.
And then he had 100 pages of detailed statistical analysis of why there were you couldn't demonstrate an increase in IQ score in any of these programs. Now, Head Start had just begun, so Head Start wasn't included.
Yeah, but I reviewed the literature on Head Start too extensively, and basically what happened was that so that was, for those of the viewers who don't know, Head Start was a nationwide attempt to add additional education to the lives of disadvantaged kids, especially at the preschool level. And basically what happened was that they actually did show improvements in academic achievement initially. So in grade 1 and grade 2, they were performing above their peers, but then the difference in performance started to decrease, and then by about the grade 5 or grade 6, the differences had disappeared completely. So there was no evidence whatsoever of that either of a stable one-time long-term gain in cognitive ability Or what people were really hoping was that if you intervened early enough, you'd get something that would sort of would turn into a positive feedback loop, and the gains would actually advance across time. And what ended up happening with the Head Start research basically was the conclusion that it produced no cognitive improvements whatsoever, although more kids who went through Head Start graduated from high school, fewer of them were delinquent, fewer of them became pregnant in the teenage years, and more of them went to colleges. But that seemed to be because they were better socialized, not because they were in any way had been made smarter. So that was a really tremendous disappointment, because it was a bipartisan attempt to come to grips with the fundamental issues that sort of bedeviled structural poverty in the United States. No one was happy about that outcome, I can tell you.
Well, not only that, but when Jensen published his article, he also said that since IQ increases seem not to be coming from these intense environmental interventions, we should consider the possibility that these differences have a genetic component. And that really began the incendiary descent of intelligence research to the periphery. Because the reaction against that was universal, because it implied a genetic inferiority if you didn't have genes for IQ.
It's also something that's universally hated on both sides of the political spectrum, because on the liberal end, the idea fundamentally is that everybody's the same, and that if you distribute educational resources properly, then everyone can succeed. And so that didn't work out so well for the liberals. And then on the conservative side, the idea is, well, if you could just get off your lazy asses and get a job, there is a job for you out there. And the truth of the matter is, you can tell me what you think about this, but this was a statistic that just absolutely shocked and staggered me when I went through the intelligence literature. So, it is illegal in the United States to induct anybody who has an IQ of less than 83. And the reason for that is, that the American Armed Forces have been conducting intelligence research for like more than 100 years. And that was partly because they needed a way of sorting people rapidly during times of military expansion during wartime. But it was also because IQ tests, and especially in the early part of the 20th century, were used to identify, let's say, the deserving poor who could really benefit from additional educational attainment and advancement. And the military was hoping to identify people from lower class strata that could be streamed into, say, officer training programs and so forth, or even skills training programs, to move people from the underclass into at least the working class and maybe above. So they had a bloody stake in this, man. They wanted to find people, they wanted to sort them properly, and they wanted to do social good when they weren't just trying to win a war, let's say, which often also is a social good. But what happened was that I don't remember when this legislation was introduced, but it was in the later part of the 20th century. But their basic finding was that by, say, the 1980s, they had determined that if you had an IQ of less than 83, there was not a damn thing that the Army could do, the armed forces could do, to transform you into someone who could do something that was more productive than non-productive. And the terrible thing about that is that it's about 10% of the population. And so you look at a statistic like that and you think, oh my God, you've got this enterprise, this massive enterprise that's chronically hungry for people. That's right. They're always looking for people. They're really oriented towards taking people from the underclass and lower working class and pushing them up the societal strata. And during wartime, they're actually desperate to bring in recruits, period. And their conclusion is that 10% of the population can't be trained to do anything sufficiently useful to make them militarily operable. I just read that. My jaw just dropped. It's like...
Well, yeah, in the United States, we have about 330 million people. And because of the distribution, the relatively normal distribution of IQ scores, about 16% have IQs of 85 or less.
Right.
Which means they're not going to graduate school.
No, it means that from what I've read practically, it means the Wonderlit company has actually done they have a nice IQ test from the commercial perspective. It's actually psychometrically valid. And they've linked IQ levels to specifically to job categories,
Yes, I know. What I was going to say is they're not only not going to graduate school, they're not going to find a stable job that pays a livable wage.
Yeah. Now, especially even given that so many of the service jobs now require a fair high degree of computational savvy, or ability, no, I mean, not computation, but ability to interact with complex computational technology. Even the typical till at a checkout market, or the till at a McDonald's, because McDonald's is actually very complicated, is often far beyond the ability of people who are on the low end of the intelligence distribution. And they claimed, I think it was Wunderlich, although it might have been Hunt. What's his name? He's IQ researcher. Is it Earl Hunt? I think possibly.
Earl Hunt.
What he claimed that if you have an IQ of below 90, that it's difficult. It's difficult for you to read well enough to translate what you're reading into action. So you can't actually read instructions and follow them. You don't have that level of literacy.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So I was going to say that in the United States, this bottom 16% translates into 51 million people,
right,
including 13 million children who are in school.
Right.
This is a very difficult problem. Now, I knew Earl Hunt. He passed away last year. Knew him pretty well. He also would say that there is this cognitive segregation in society. This is a point that Charles Murray makes well. And Earl would often ask, when's the last time you had someone over for dinner who wasn't a college graduate?
Yeah. Well, that was something that Murray and Herrnstein wrote about in their book, The Bell Curve, which really struck me, because I read that book twice, unlike most of the people who criticized it.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that they pointed out in there was, look, the typical educated person thinks that someone isn't very bright if they have an IQ of 115. So we're talking about graduate level and PhD level research institutions, right? Because 115, there's as many people at 115 above as there are at 85 and below. And so it's a minority of the population, and that's the top 15%. And, that's the duller undergraduate.
Right.
So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've dealt with people who had ranges in the low 80s and tried to find them jobs and tried to train them. And I have some real knowledge about the stunning gap between people at the low end of the IQ distribution and the high end. And it's no bloody wonder people hate IQ research and intelligence research, because it reveals a set of seriously dismal facts about the incredible range of ability among human beings.
Well, yes, this is true. And moreover, I would add to this that people in universities, professors and graduate students, have a hard time understanding what everyday life is like if you have an IQ of 80 or 85. And you're making your way, you're living independently, you're making your way in the world. But it is a challenge.
Oh.
It is
challenge. It just barely begins to describe it. I had a client who, he probably had an IQ of under 80, the nonverbal portion of it anyways. And he was indistinguishable in physical appearance from, let's say, I hate to use the phrase normal person, but there was nothing that marked him out about particularly intellectually impaired, And I tried at one point. This was so telling to me. I got him a volunteer job, which, by the way, is very difficult. It's harder to get a volunteer job than a real job, because you have to do police screening and all sorts of things, and the selection process is just as extreme. But I eventually ended up getting him a job at a bike/bookstore, but that place couldn't hold him once the subsidy program had expired. And then I got him a job at a charity, and his job was to fold letters into 3 so that they could be put into envelopes. Well, that sounds easy, except that he also had a bit of a motor tremor. And, it took me about 30 hours to train him to fold up a piece of paper with sufficient precision so that it could be put in an envelope rapidly, so that the envelope wasn't so mangled that it would get stuck in the automatic sorting machine. And, there was high performance demands on him, too. He had to whip through those letters pretty quickly. And then sometimes the letters would have a photograph appended to them that was stapled on. and they weren't always stapled on in the same place. So then he had to calculate how to fold the paper over the photograph without bending the photograph in precise thirds so that it would still fit in the envelope. And then he had to separate the French letters from the English letters and associate them with the proper envelopes. And like that level of complexity just did him in.
Let me say two things about this. One is, I hope, common sense, and the other is pretty provocative. The common sense thing is we have to be very careful when we have these discussions not to devalue the human dignity of people who aren't in the upper end of the distribution. And if there's one criticism that I think is fair, is sometimes in these conversations it sounds like we're devaluing people at the lower end of the distribution. And we have to be very careful that we don't do that. Human life has dignity, and IQ is not the most important thing that defines human beings.
Yes, it's not associated with wisdom. It's not necessarily associated with truth or with courage or with many virtues that are
being likable.
Right. It's not correlated at all with being likable.
Or honest.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we know the psychometric relationship between intelligence and conscientiousness is zero.
Right. So I think we have to make that point.
Yes, I agree. I'm trying to make the point about how difficult it is for people who are on the low end of the cognitive spectrum to survive in an increasingly complex, cognitively sophisticated environment. Their jobs are just disappearing.
Yes, absolutely. And now let's ask the question, is there anything that could be done about that? Well, Western society has tried very hard with a number of environmentally based interventions, early childhood education. By the way, you said the literature in organizational psychology is very clear. The literature is equally clear in educational psychology.
Oh yeah, well the relationship between IQ and learning is even more powerful than the relationship between IQ and job performance.
That's right, which is kind of common sense, or it matches our common sense. But, if you put a bunch of variables into a regression equation to predict academic achievement, and you have all these school quality variables and teacher quality variables and cognitive variables of the students, and what you find is the teacher variables and the quality of the school variables together barely account for 10% of the variance.
Yeah, I know. It's terrible. Well, and I talked to the guy who ran admissions at Harvard. I taught at Harvard for a while. His name was Dean Whitlaw, and he is a really smart guy. I really liked Dean. And, he was, let's say, he was on the right side of the human race, and he was really trying to figure out how to run the admissions policy at Harvard so that it did the best for everyone concerned. And he had run an interesting series of analysis that I don't believe he ever published. And one of them was, well, let's say you segregate the Harvard population into the relatively low IQ kids. So maybe they only have an IQ of 130, and the relatively high IQ kids who are pushing up towards to 160. So you got two competing hypotheses there. One would be that the lower IQ kids come to Harvard, this remarkable environment, and they thrive because of the high educational quality so well that they close the gap between them and the 160 kids, and that's just completely wrong. What happens is you put both those groups there, both very, very highly selected, but some in the sort of Superman range intellectually, and what happens is the gap just gets bigger and bigger as they progress through university. And it's a dreaded example of that Matthew principle that the economists talk about, which is, to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's very, very, it's no wonder people dislike this research. It's so anti-egalitarian in its essential structure.
Well, I wanted to make a second point that I said would be provocative. If you want to do something about this, we tried a bunch of interventions, earnest, well-funded, long-term interventions don't seem to work. But neuroscience has been excluded from discussions about what to do about this. And I believe that the progress in neuroscience research has the potential to really dramatically increase the G factor.
Well, that's an optimistic statement, so I'm sure we're looking forward to some support for that one.
It's optimistic and controversial. And, just as a thought experiment, and I can tell you why I believe this is possible. Well, first, before I tell you the thought experiment, the reason I'm optimistic is that it is because of the high heritability of the G factor. That means, if genes are involved, genes work through biology, even if environment interacts with that. But basically, you have a neurobiological system. It's complex, but as you begin to understand it, you can tweak it. This is what all medicine is doing now. They're trying to understand the neurobiology/genetic basis of our health and our diseases. Why? So they can fix it. So they can, when you go to the doctor, you're going because your biology is broken and you want your biology fixed. Well, let's think about the brain. Now, no one conceptualizes low IQ as a disease, and it's a little dangerous. But to the extent to which low IQ has a genetic input or a genetic influence, that's the extent to which you might be able to find out how that works, what that system is, and then figure out how to tweak that system to increase IQ. It's not science fiction. I mean, that's a plausible sequence of events. What the problem is, it's a very complex sequence of events. But I also think it's a finite set of problems, not an infinite set of problems. So, if physicists can figure out what happened during the first nanoseconds of the Big Bang, we can certainly figure out what the neurobiology of intellect is and how to tweak it. So I think that's possible. So now let's do a thought experiment. And let's imagine there's an IQ pill. And I mean that metaphorically, not literally a pill you could take, like putting but like having fluoridated water just kind of raises the dental health of everybody. It would be nice if we had that for IQ, but just imagine what it would be like if we shifted the distribution of IQ 15 points into the high end, so that now the average IQ, and I understand how IQ is computed and norming and everything, but the point is that no one would have an IQ less than 100.
Right.
What would the world be like if everyone could reason sufficiently to get a reasonable job?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the what would you call the perverse part of me? It's funny. I was just talking to one of my graduate students. We've been looking at the determinants of male attractiveness by the personality of female viewers. Okay, and so what we found is that there are some personality effects. So extroverted, enthusiastic women tend to rate men, generally speaking, as more attractive than introverted and less enthusiastic women. And so there are some just straight personality effects, but the biggest effect by far we found was the proclivity of women in general to rate men as less attractive as the women's IQ increased. And so the other thing that we don't know is what price we pay for accelerated IQ from a broader perspective, because I know that there is some evidence, and you can tell me what you think about this, because I know that there's reasonable evidence that the average IQ of the Ashkenazi Jewish population is about 15 points higher than the standard population, which kind of makes it a thought experiment or an experiment, real life experiment that's equivalent to the one that you laid out. But Ashkenazi Jews also tend to suffer from a host of neurological diseases that seem to be associated with increased neuroplasticity. And so, to me, it's often hard to gain on one front without losing on another. I mean, that's the evolutionary conundrum, obviously, but
we call that the social justice theory. If
yeah, right.
On one thing, you have to be bad on everything else to kind of balance it out.
Yeah, well, generally speaking, you do pay a price for your exceptionalism.
I don't think that's true because the Julian Stanley studies of the mathematically precocious kids essentially found not only were they smart, but they were more mature than their age peers. They were better looking, they were taller, they were physically more fit. I mean, it was kind of the anti-social.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, well, I mean, it's just that also might be true because one of the things that can interfere with IQ is poor health and poor nutritional quality and all of that. I mean, it doesn't look like it's that easy to increase IQ, but it looks like it's pretty easy to decrease it.
Yeah, I think that those things have to be pretty extreme.
Yeah.
To have an effect, and those effects may not be permanent, actually. There's some studies of deprivation of people who suffered deprivation during the Second World War that suggest that those really severe deprivations didn't have lasting effects on them.
Well, people are pretty tough, so I'm inclined to agree with that. So have you seen any animal experimental work that you regard as compelling that shows something like the transformation of animal cognition into something that's higher order that you regard as compelling?
Not sure what you mean, but there's certainly animal work that shows you can extract a G factor from cognitive tests given to various animals.
Right. So what I was wondering is, has there been any evidence that you regard as credible showing that could be that so-called animal G factor extracted in the same? We should tell our readers too, the way you extract the G factor, I'm going to say it very, very rapidly, is imagine you take a randomly selected set of 200 questions that require abstraction of one form or another to solve. And then you give those 200 questions to 100 people and you sum the scores and you rank order them, you get something that's roughly equivalent there to a G factor. It's roughly that. So
I would say it a little bit differently, just so everyone's on the same page. If you think of all the different mental abilities and you devise a test for each one of them, and you gave this test to a lot of people across the range of ability, what you'll find is the scores on all those tests are positively correlated with each other, suggesting that all tests of mental ability have something in common.
Right, sure, that's a great way of putting it.
Common is this G factor, this general ability to reason. And some individual tests have more G loading than other individual tests.
Right.
So, yes. And tests of abstract reasoning tend to be highly G loaded.
Right.
If I said to you, repeat the following numbers back to me, 3, 7, 2, 1, 6, 5, that's not a very highly G-loaded mental ability to be able to do that. But if I gave you a string like that and said, repeat them to me backwards, that becomes a G-loaded ability because you do a transformation.
Yes, well, the other thing to say about that, too, is that the positive relationship between those multiple assessments that you described is actually quite high.
Right.
Right, that's the thing, is that general factor not only exists across domains of cognitive ability, but it tends to account for a substantial amount of the ability in each of those domains. So it's kind of like G is kind of like a black hole for intelligence research, and everything keeps falling into it. So
that's an interesting way to put it, because now we have these genome-wide association studies that are finding these bits of DNA that are related to a latent factor of intelligence, which is the G factor, or to what they call educational attainment variables. Educational attainment is so highly correlated with IQ that it's essentially the same thing. So we're really moving. When I was in graduate school, the question was, is there a genetic component to intelligence or not? To this kind of DNA analysis, trying to find bits of DNA that are going to be related to what we call intelligence or IQ testing or the G factor, and they seem to exist. There seems to be hundreds of them, each a tiny effect, which will make the ultimate story extremely complicated. But as I said before, I think it's a finite set of problems.
Right.
And at the end of that sequence of solving those problems, I think there's a good chance we'll know how to increase IQ. And I think it's a good thing to be able to do that. You know, I have said publicly that more intelligence is better than less. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I get criticized because that implies that people with less intelligence aren't as worthwhile. That's why I want to be very careful that I don't believe that.
Yes, but they have harder lives is more the accurate way of thinking about it. And harder lives in a narrower range of possibilities and opportunities.
That's right. And in my view, my political bias is, therefore, governments have a moral responsibility to help those people. And a lot of government programs aren't going to do it because, you know, job training requires a certain level of G.
Yeah, my low IQ clients, they used to go to the government agencies that were designed to help people find employment, and you know the typical response was, well, just go home and type up your CV and distribute it. It's like, you just go, like, I can't use a computer, I can't type, I don't know what a CV is. It's like it's a non-starter in all three counts.
That's right. So in the United States, there are 51 million people with IQs under 85, and there are about 43 million people living in poverty. Do you think those Venn diagrams intersect?
Yeah. Well, we should also be clear about this because it is so politically suspect, is that it's not like it's self-evident that people who have less cognitive capability are likely to end up poor, because there are serious, complex problems in life that beset them that they have a difficult time dealing with, and they can't learn as quickly. And so the relationship between poverty and intelligence is self-evident if you're willing to think it through for any length of time. It doesn't mean that everybody who's rich it doesn't mean that everyone who is rich is smart, and it doesn't mean that everyone who is poor is stupid. To be blunt, but what it does mean is that if you're intelligent, you're much more likely to become financially successful. And I think it was the Herrnstein and Murray, I think, did the calculations back in the bell curve that indicated that if you imagine that you are a fairy godmother and you have your newborn grandchild in front of you, and you can grant them 3 standard deviations above the mean, in terms of wealth at birth, or you can grant them 3 standard deviations above the mean in terms of IQ at birth, and then you wanted to determine which would work better for them by the time they were 40, and the answer to that was quite clear, is that IQ trumps wealth in terms of its ability to predict a positive future. So,
yes, yeah. And that's why I'm so interested in the concept of increasing IQ, or increasing the G factor, not just the IQ score, but really what under this reasoning ability. So, you know, some people have tried to teach college students critical thinking.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing.
You're smart and you can think critically, so much the better.
Exactly, you know. And, you know, it may sound to your listeners, I just want to take a moment out here. It may sound to your listeners like, here are these two guys pontificating about what it's like to be smart, what it's like to be not so smart. I mean, the point of this, the point of neuroscience research on intelligence, and what I hope to achieve by writing the book, was to show that the genetic aspects are not deterministic. Mm-hmm. It's the opposite. Mm-hmm. Genes are probabilistic. So the extent to which something like intelligence is genetic, in my view, is the extent to which we'll learn how to change it for the better.
Right. Well, that's definitely, yeah, because people do tend to think about biological factors as deterministic, and that's a mistake because they can be shifted. So with regards to the animal study, so, you know, you pointed out that you can come up with an IQ-like estimate for, say, a rat. And have you seen anything that indicates, I don't care how it's done, through training or neurochemically or by promoting brain function in different ways, however you might do it, that's actually indicated to you that there is a way of biologically enhancing the general cognitive ability even of an animal? Has anything come out credible?
Just by breeding mice who run a maze faster than other mice together, you get mice that seem to be able to learn how to run a maze faster. But that's work from the 1980s.
Right.
So I review this in the book. There are some interesting technologies that have been developed where you can turn parts of a rat brain on and off at will and see what happens. This has not yet been applied, as far as I know, to learning.
Mm.
But interestingly, there are human studies underway with things like transcranial magnetic stimulation and